The final shovel of dirt fell with a hollow thud, a sound that sealed more than just the grave. It sealed a life. Elara stood across the raw earth from Marcus, her husband Thomas's brother, and felt the chill of the November wind cut deeper than sorrow. The wind was honest. Marcus was not. The preacher's words about dust and ashes had faded, but the town's whispers remained. They clung to the air like wood smoke, thick with pity and speculation. Providence Creek had buried one of its own, and now it was watching to see what would become of the woman he left behind. They did not have to wait long. Back at the farmhouse, the home she and Thomas had built from raw timber and stubborn hope, the verdict was delivered. Marcus, his face a mask of false sympathy, held the papers. His wife, Eleanor, stood behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over the small cabin as if measuring it for new curtains. The farm, the good, fertile bottomland that Thomas had poured his life into, was not hers. A debt, Marcus explained, a forgotten note Thomas had signed, making Marcus the sole beneficiary in the event of his death. It was a lie, as clean and sharp as a new axe blade, but she had no way to prove it. "You are family, of course," Marcus said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "We would not see you cast out with nothing." He pushed a small, clinking pouch across the table. $20. Beside it, he placed a folded deed, its paper yellowed and brittle. And this. Thomas always kept it, a foolish purchase from his youth. The old limestone quarry north of the ridge. It is worthless, of course, nothing but a hole, but it is land. It is yours. The injustice was a physical thing, a hot stone in her gut. This house, with the scent of Thomas's pipe still lingering in the wool blankets, the notches on the doorframe marking his height, was being stolen from her in broad daylight with the silent consent of the entire community. They saw a grieving widow, a burden. Marcus was offering a solution, however cruel. He was giving her a hole in the ground and calling it charity. She looked from the pouch of coins to the worthless deed. 24 years old, and her entire world had been reduced to this. The town saw two paths for her. She could accept a position as a housekeeper for a family in town, an object of perpetual pity, or she could take her $20 and buy a ticket on the next stagecoach east, vanishing back into the anonymity from which she came. They waited for her to weep. They waited for her to plead. Elara did neither. She looked at Marcus's hard, expectant eyes and Eleanor's triumphant smirk. She looked past them, through the open doorway, to the gray, unforgiving hills. A quiet, cold resolve settled in her bones. It was not a fire of anger, but the dense, unyielding weight of ice. She would not be their charity case. She would not run. She picked up the coins. She picked up the deed. "I will need a good axe," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in her soul. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, leaned on his counter, his expression a mixture of pity and condescension. "Now, Elara," he began, polishing a glass jar with his apron. "You take that money and you go see the pastor. The church has a fund. Or better yet, buy a ticket. There is nothing for a woman alone out here." She placed $3 silver on the worn wood. "An axe," she repeated, "a broad-headed felling axe, and a shovel, and 10 pounds of salt." He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. He sold her the tools, along with a sack of flour, beans, and a small wedge of bacon. It cost her nearly half of all she had. As she left the store, the tools heavy in her arms, she heard the whispers behind her. "The quarry? Has she lost her mind? That place is a death trap. Poor thing. Grief has broken her." She did not look back. She walked past the church, past the blacksmith's forge, past the faces that stared at her as if she were already a ghost. She walked out of Providence Creek, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the northern ridge. Her only companion was Boulder, Thomas's big, quiet dog, a mix of hound and something sturdier, who trotted at her heel, his presence a silent, unwavering loyalty in a world that had offered none. She was walking toward a hole in the ground. She was walking toward what everyone believed was her end. The journey was a penance. The cart she'd been allowed to keep, a rickety thing with one wobbly wheel, was loaded with her meager possessions: the tools, the food, a cast-iron pot, 2 wool blankets, a tinderbox, and Thomas's old hunting knife. Every step away from the familiar valley was a step into a harsher world. The path dwindled from a wagon track to a game trail, then to nothing at all. The land grew steep and stingy, all rock and thorny scrub. The weight of the axe in her hand was a cold comfort, the weight of her future. Boulder ranged ahead, his nose to the ground, his solid form a dark shape against the dying landscape. He was the only living thing that was not a stranger. He did not judge. He did not pity. He simply was. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the warmth from her shawl, whispering of the coming winter. Each gust felt like the town's collective voice, mocking her, telling her to turn back. After 2 days of brutal travel, she found it. The quarry was not just a hole, it was a scar, a violent gouge ripped from the hillside decades ago and abandoned. A sheer wall of gray limestone rose on one side, fractured and menacing. The other sides sloped steeply down into a pit filled with rubble, thorny bushes, and the skeletal remains of old mining equipment. It was a place of failure, a place of jagged edges and profound emptiness. She stood at the lip of the pit, the wind tearing at her hair, and for the first time, the ice of her resolve threatened to crack. This was it. This was her inheritance. A broken, barren pit, exposed to the sky. The town was right. Marcus was right. Despair was a physical force, pressing down on her shoulders, making her knees weak. Tears, hot and sharp, finally burned her eyes. She had been so determined not to break in front of them. But here, with only the wind as a witness, the futility of it all washed over her. She had traded a warm home for a grave with no lid. Boulder, sensing her distress, nudged his cold nose into her hand. His silent companionship was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She took a ragged breath, wiping her eyes with the back of a dirty hand. Crying would not change the rock. Crying would not build a shelter. She had to go down. She had to see the entirety of her hopeless domain. Carefully, she guided the cart down a treacherous, crumbling track into the pit. The air changed as she descended. The howling wind that had plagued her journey faded, replaced by an unnerving stillness. At the bottom, surrounded by the high rock walls, the world went quiet. The air was cold, but it was a dead, motionless cold, free from the wind's biting teeth. She stood in the center of the pit, 20 feet below the surrounding landscape, and felt as if she were at the bottom of a great stone cup. Her gaze traced the sheer back wall of the quarry. It was there she saw it. A dark stain, almost black, weeping from a fissure in the limestone about halfway up. Below it, a patch of moss, impossibly green against the gray stone, clung to a narrow ledge. Water. A slow, steady drip of clean water filtering through the rock. It was not a gushing spring, but it was constant. It was life. She moved closer, her boots crunching on loose gravel. As she stood near the base of the massive wall, she noticed something else. The rock itself seemed to hum with a faint, residual energy. She pressed her palm against it. It was cold, yes, but it was a different kind of cold than the air. It was the deep, profound cold of the earth, stable and unchanging. It did not steal her heat. It simply existed. This stone, she realized, held its temperature. In the summer, it would hold the cool. In the winter, if warmed, it would hold the heat. It was thermal mass. A new feeling began to displace the despair. It was not hope, not yet. It was a grim, calculating resolve. The pit offered protection from the wind. The wall offered water and a thermal battery. The rubble on the floor was a ready supply of building stone. The world saw a worthless hole. Ilara began to see the faint outline of a system. The town was wrong. This was not a grave. It was a foundation. The work began before the sun was fully up the next morning. It was a brutal, relentless assault on the earth, fueled by dwindling supplies of bacon and beans and an inexhaustible reserve of sheer will. Her first task was to carve a space, a foothold for life against the indifferent stone. She chose a spot at the base of the sheer quarry wall, where a natural indentation already existed, offering the beginnings of a roof. She attacked the earth with the shovel. The ground was a stubborn mix of clay and stone, and every shovelful felt like a battle. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and baking, were raw by noon. By sunset, they were a mess of broken blisters. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from her spare dress. The rhythm of the work took over. Drive the shovel, lift, toss. Drive, lift, toss. Her world shrank to the scrape of metal on stone, the grunt of her own breath, the growing pile of displaced earth. Section Boulder watched her, a silent, worried sentinel. He would occasionally bring her a stick or lay his head on her knee when she paused, his brown eyes full of a question she could not answer. How long could this last? She was not just digging a hole, she was shaping a room. She dug back into the earthen slope, creating a space 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide. The back wall was the solid limestone of the quarry itself. The side walls were packed earth. She used the largest, flattest stones from the rubble pile to build a low retaining wall at the front, a foundation for the shelter to come. Lifting them was a torment. Her back screamed, her legs trembled with exhaustion. More than once, a stone slipped, crushing her fingers, sending a jolt of white-hot agony up her arm. She would curse, her voice swallowed by the pit's silence, and then she would try again. Days blurred into a single, continuous ache. She rose in the gray pre-dawn, ate a cold biscuit, and worked until the last light failed. She learned the language of leverage, using a stout log as a pry bar to move stones she could never lift. She learned the geometry of a stable wall, fitting stones together like a brutalist puzzle. She discovered a thick deposit of rich, sticky clay near the water seep, perfect for mortar. She mixed it with water and dry grass, pounding it with her feet until it was a thick, pliable paste. She chinked the gaps in her stone wall, sealing it against the wind she could not feel, but knew was always waiting just above the rim of the pit. Timber was the next challenge. The woods above the quarry were thick with deadfall from a storm years past. She spent 2 days clearing a path up the treacherous slope, then another week felling, trimming, and hauling logs down into the pit. She was not a woodcutter. Her first attempts were clumsy and dangerous. The axe felt alien in her hands. But she learned. She learned to read the lean of a tree, to cut a proper notch. The crash of a falling tree was a terrifying, triumphant sound in the stillness. Getting the logs down into the quarry was a Herculean task. She would heave and push them to the edge, then guide them with ropes as they slid and tumbled to the bottom. Each log was a victory. She laid them across the top of her stone wall to the earthen bank behind, creating the joists for a roof. She covered them with a thick layer of branches, then slabs of slate she found in the rubble, and finally a foot of packed earth and sod. Her shelter was a dugout, a cave, a cabin, a hybrid born of necessity. It was ugly and low, but it was solid. The heart of the home was the hearth. She built it against the back wall of solid limestone, a deep firebox of carefully selected stones mortared with her best clay. The chimney was a nightmare. She had to build it up the face of the rock, a precarious, vertical puzzle. She used a fissure in the rock as a natural guide for the flue. When it was done, towering 15 feet up the rock face, she stood back, her body a single symphony of pain, and looked at what her hands had made. The moment of truth came on a bitterly cold evening. She laid a fire with trembling hands, using the last of her tinder. She struck the flint and steel, praying the spark would catch. It did. A small flame flickered, caught a twig, then a larger piece of kindling. Smoke wafted, then hesitated, and then, with a soft whoosh, it drew up the chimney. It worked. The smoke was pulling clean. She sat on the dirt floor, wrapped in a blanket with Boulder curled at her side, and watched the flames. The fire was not just burning wood, it was burning away the cold, the despair, the loneliness. The stone wall behind the hearth began to warm, a slow, deep heat that radiated into the small space. It was a warmth that felt ancient and profound. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep, safe in the embrace of the earth she had tamed. But survival required more than just shelter and warmth. It required a system: food, water, a way to endure the winter that was now settling its grim weight upon the land. The water seep was her first priority. She spent a week carving a small channel in the rock, guiding the steady drip, drip, drip into a hollow she dug and lined with a thick layer of puddled clay. This cistern, her private well, filled slowly, a gallon a day, with water so cold and clean it tasted of the stone itself. With her last few dollars, she made the trip back to Providence Creek. It was a journey into a world that had forgotten her, or rather, had consigned her to a grim fate of its own imagining. When she walked into Gable's Mercantile, leading a small, shaggy pack mule she'd borrowed from an old trapper for $1, the conversation stopped. The men around the stove stared. Mr. Gable polished a counter that was already gleaming. "Elara," he said, his voice holding a note of shock, "we thought, well, we were worried." "I need supplies," she said, ignoring the lie. "And I need to buy livestock." The word hung in the air. Livestock. For the quarry. A man in the corner snorted into his coffee. "What you gonna raise in that pit? Lizards?" She laid her list on the counter. 6 laying hens, a rooster, and a pregnant nanny goat he had advertised for sale. She also bought seeds, turnips, carrots, kale, and more salt, sugar, and a bag of cornmeal. Gable looked at her as if she were mad. "A goat? Chickens? Where in God's name will you keep them?" "I have a place," she said simply. The transaction was a public spectacle. As she paid, she could feel the weight of their disbelief. They saw a woman throwing good money after bad, clinging to a foolish, doomed fantasy. The nickname she'd earned on her last visit had evolved. They didn't just call her the Folly Girl anymore. As she led her small menagerie out of town, the goat complaining loudly, the chickens squawking in a crate on the mule's back, she heard one of the men say it loud enough for her to hear. "There goes Sunken Hen Elara. Bet the coyotes eat well tonight." The name stuck. Sunken Hen. It was a brand of mockery, a label that defined her as the town fool. But Elara did not care. She had her animals. She had her seeds. She had her fortress of stone and earth. Let them laugh. Winter was coming, and she had work to do. Back in her quarry, she expanded her dugout. She dug a separate, smaller chamber for the animals, connected to the main room, but with its own door. It was warm and secure, protected from predators and the wind. The body heat of the animals would help warm the entire structure. The chickens began to lay eggs within a week, small, precious proteins in a world of beans and cornmeal. The goat, whom she named Shale, provided a quart of rich milk every day. Her garden was her most ambitious project. In the most protected corner of the quarry floor, she built a low stone wall to create a raised bed. She spent weeks hauling dirt from the woods and mixing it with goat manure and ash from her fire. The soil was rich and black. In this sunken, windless world, the ground temperature was a few degrees warmer than the exposed land above. She planted her winter vegetables. It was a gamble against the coming frost, but it was a gamble she had to take. She was building not just a shelter, but a tiny, self-sustaining kingdom, hidden from the world that had cast her out. The first snow fell in late December, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. The real winter was gathering its forces. Marcus chose that day to visit. He rode his fine bay horse to the edge of the quarry and looked down, his face a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He had expected to find her gone, or worse. He did not expect to see the wisp of smoke rising from a well-built chimney, nor the solid, earth-covered roof of her dwelling. He dismounted and made his way down the path. Boulder met him with a low growl, standing his ground until Elara spoke a quiet word. Marcus stopped a few feet from her door, taking in the scene. The neat stack of firewood, the secure animal pen, the small, tidy garden bed covered with a thin layer of protective straw. It was an image of order and persistence, not the squalor he had imagined. "Living like a badger in a hole, Elara," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He was trying to reassert his power, to remind her of her lowly station. "I'm surprised you've lasted this long. Thomas would be ashamed to see you grubbing in the dirt like this." She was cleaning a snare, her hands deft and sure. She did not look up. "Thomas was not afraid of dirt," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He was afraid of debt. Funny how that worked out." The barb hit its mark. A flicker of anger crossed his face. "This is a temporary foolishness. When the real storms come, this hole will either flood or bury you. You should have taken my offer of a place in town." "I have a place," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were as hard and gray as the quarry stone. There was no fear in them. There was no pleading. There was nothing he could use against her. He left in a cloud of frustration, his mockery having failed to find a purchase. His visit, meant to break her spirit, had only hardened it. She was alone, but she was not lonely. The rhythms of her life were dictated by the sun, the fire, and the needs of her animals. She woke in the dark, tended the fire that never went out, milked Shale, collected the eggs. She checked her snares, repaired her tools, and tended her small garden, which, against all odds, was thriving. Small, hardy green leaves of kale pushed up through the soil, a miracle of color in the monochrome world. The deep winter locked the world in its grip. Snow fell for days, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. Providence Creek felt a world away. Her universe was the 50-foot circle of the quarry floor and the warm, fire-lit interior of her home. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the soft clucking of the hens, and the rhythmic sound of her own breathing. She was the sovereign of this small, sunken world. The stone walls held the heat of the fire, creating a stable, comfortable warmth that the flimsy wooden houses in town could never match. The town's mockery, the name Sunken Hen, felt like a story from another life. Her systems faced their first real test when a pack of wolves, driven by hunger from the high country, descended into the valley. She heard them first, a series of lonesome howls that grew closer and closer. Boulder stood at the door, a deep, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. The wolves circled the quarry rim, their dark shapes stark against the moonlit snow. They could smell the goat, the chickens. They were looking for a way in. But there was no way in. The sheer walls were too high to scale, and the single entrance was a narrow, defensible path guarded by a solid wooden door and a very determined dog. After an hour of frustrated circling, their howls echoing off the stone walls, they moved on. Ilara stood inside, her hand on Boulder's steady back, and felt a surge of pride. Her shelter had held. It was more than a home, it was a fortress. She had built a place the winter could not touch, and the wolves could not enter. The spring came late and reluctant, but when it did, it transformed the quarry. The water seep ran faster, filling her cistern. Her goat, Shale, gave birth to 2 healthy kids. The kale and turnips had survived the winter, providing fresh greens when she needed them most. She had not just survived, she had prevailed. She was leaner, harder, her hands permanently calloused, but she was stronger than she had ever been. The true test, however, was yet to come. It arrived not as the honest cold of winter, but as a strange, malevolent warmth in late summer. The air grew thick and heavy, the color of an old bruise. The sky to the west turned a sickly, greenish yellow. Birds stopped singing. An unnatural silence fell over the land, a silence that felt like a held breath. Ilara, attuned to the subtle language of the natural world, felt a primal fear stir. She secured the animals in their pen, latched her door, and checked the braces on her roof. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it was a power her small world had not yet faced. It began as a low moan on the horizon, a sound that grew steadily into a deafening, terrifying roar. It was not the sound of wind, it was the sound of the world being torn apart. The cyclone hit Providence Creek like a fist of God. Above ground, the flimsy architecture of human pride was annihilated in minutes. Roofs were not just damaged, they were lifted whole and flung into the fields, disintegrating into a spray of shingles and splinters. The walls of Mr. Gable's mercantile buckled and collapsed, burying his carefully stacked supplies under a mountain of debris. The church steeple, the town's proudest landmark, cracked like a whip and was thrown to the ground. Barns, filled with livestock and the summer's hay, simply vanished, their foundations wiped clean. In town, it was chaos and terror. Families huddled in root cellars as their homes were ripped away above them. The air was a maelstrom of wood, glass, and earth. The sound was a physical assault, a continuous, grinding shriek that vibrated deep in the bones. The community's confidence, built on the illusion of solid walls and predictable seasons, was shattered in the space of 10 minutes. Their preparations, their conventional wisdom, had failed utterly. Down in her quarry, Ilara experienced the storm as a muffled cataclysm. The roar was a deep, earth-shaking rumble that traveled through the rock. The ground trembled. Dust sifted from the ceiling timbers of her dugout. The flame in her hearth danced and flickered wildly as the pressure outside fluctuated. Her animals were terrified, the goats bleating and the chickens in a frantic flutter, but they were safe. Boulder stood pressed against her leg, whining low in his throat, his body rigid with tension. She could feel the storm's fury passing over her, like a great, blind beast. The wind screamed across the lip of the quarry, but it could not reach down to claw at her shelter. The solid stone walls did not move. The earthen roof held firm. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach, tucked into a pocket of stillness, while the world above was rendered into chaos. The ingenuity of her system, born of desperation and mockery, was now her salvation. She sat in the dim, steady warmth of her home, listening to the death of the world above, and she was still there. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. An eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the panicked bleating of Shale's kids. The air outside smelled of pulverized wood and wet earth. Cautiously, Ilara unbarred her door and looked out. The sky was a strange, bruised purple, but clearing in the west. The floor of her quarry was littered with leaves, branches, and strange debris. A single woman's bonnet, a child's wooden toy, a splintered piece of a church pew, ghosts of the life that had existed just moments before. She was taking stock of the minor damage, a few dislodged roof slates, a scattered woodpile, when she heard it. A voice, hoarse and desperate, crying her name from the rim of the quarry. "Ilara! For the love of God, help us!" She looked up. It was Marcus. He was a ruin of a man, his clothes torn, his face caked with mud and blood. One arm hung at a useless, broken angle. He half stumbled, half fell down the path into the pit, his eyes wild with a terror that went beyond his own pain. He collapsed at her feet, gasping for breath. "It's Clara," he choked out, his voice a raw rasp. "My girl. The house. It came down. A beam. She's pinned. I can't move it. I can't move it alone." The moment hung in the unnatural silence. Here was the man who had stolen her home, who had cast her out with a pittance and a worthless piece of land. The man who had mocked her, who had ridden out to her refuge specifically to gloat at her presumed failure. He was now on his knees, begging for her help, his life and his daughter's life dependent on the very person he had tried to destroy. A bitter, triumphant thought could have risen in her. She could have reminded him of his words, of his cruelty. She could have savored the irony of his desperation. The memory of his smug face as he handed her the deed was still a fresh wound. Her own carefully managed stores, her own safety, helping him would put it all at risk. But looking at his shattered form, seeing the genuine agony for his child in his eyes, there was no room for vengeance. The choice was not a choice at all. He was a human being in need. His daughter was a child in peril. That was the only truth that mattered. Her strength was not just in the stone walls she had built, but in the character that had been forged in solitude and hardship. She said nothing. She simply turned back into her dwelling and emerged a moment later with her longest pry bar, a coil of thick rope, and a lit lantern, for the dusk was already gathering. She looked at Marcus. "Show me where." Boulder at her heels, she followed him out of the quarry and into the wreckage of Providence Creek. The landscape was unrecognizable, a wasteland of splintered wood and scattered belongings. The journey was a nightmare obstacle course. When they reached the place where his large, proud farmhouse had stood, there was only a foundation and a heap of rubble. A single, massive roof beam lay at a sharp angle, pinning a smaller pile of debris. From beneath it came a faint, whimpering sound. Ilara's mind, honed by months of practical problem-solving, assessed the situation instantly. She saw the fulcrum points, the angles of force. She used her knowledge of leverage, learned from moving quarry stones 100 times her weight, to position the pry bar. With Marcus clearing smaller pieces of wood and Boulder digging frantically at the dirt, she put her entire body into the effort. The beam groaned, resisted, and then, with an agonizing screech, it lifted. Just enough. Marcus scrambled in, pulling his daughter free. Clara was pale and unconscious, her leg bent at a terrible angle, but she was alive. She helped Marcus fashion a crude splint and a stretcher from the wreckage. The journey back to the quarry was a slow, agonizing ordeal. As they descended into the pit, Other survivors began to appear, dazed, injured people drawn by the impossible sight of a standing chimney and a wisp of smoke. Mr. Gable was among them, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face a mask of disbelief. When Marcus, carrying his daughter, stumbled through the low doorway of Alara's home, he stopped dead. The others crowded behind him, peering into the impossible space. Their eyes, accustomed to the gray devastation outside, struggled to adjust to the warm, golden light of the fire. The warmth of the room hit their cold, damp skin first. It was a deep, radiant heat, coming not just from the fire but from the very stones of the wall. Then they saw the rest of it. The orderly stacks of firewood, the jars of preserved vegetables gleaming on a sturdy shelf, the quiet, rhythmic clucking of the chickens, safe and undisturbed in their stone-walled coop. The nanny goat and her kids nestled in clean straw, a basin of clear, fresh water from the cistern. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and baking bread from a small loaf she had set near the hearth. It was not a badger's hole. It was not a hovel. It was an ark. It was a sanctuary of warmth, order, and life in a world that had been utterly destroyed. They stood in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the reality of this place with the story they had told themselves about the foolish woman in the quarry. They had mocked her for digging in the dirt while they built their proud houses toward the sky. And the sky had torn their houses down, while the dirt had kept her safe. Marcus gently laid his daughter on Alara's own cot, his face a canvas of shame and awe. He looked at the sturdy roof beams, the well-chinked walls, the ingenious systems that sustained this hidden world. He looked at Alara, her face calm, her hands already tending to his daughter's injuries. Mr. Gable, his voice hoarse with emotion, spoke for them all. "We were wrong," he said, his words simple and heavy. "My God, Alara, we were all so wrong. We called you sunken hen. We called you a fool." He shook his head, his gaze sweeping the room again. "We were the fools." Alara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her victory, only a quiet, profound grace. Her response to their shame was not words, but action. She fetched a clean cloth and began to wash the grime from Clara's face. She handed Marcus a dipper of fresh water. "There is broth on the fire," she said to the small crowd huddled in her doorway. "And there is bread. Eat. Sit by the fire." That was her victory, not in being right, but in being kind. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a character strong enough to forgive. In the days that followed, the Sunken Hen's quarry became the heart of the shattered community. It was a hospital, a kitchen, and a council hall. Alara's carefully managed stores, her preserved food, her fresh eggs and milk, fed the injured and the homeless. Her knowledge of building with stone and earth became the most valuable currency in Providence Creek. The derisive nickname was retired. People now spoke the name Sunken Hen with a reverence and awe, as if it were the title of a queen. They didn't come to mock anymore. They came to learn. Men who had built houses their whole lives came to ask her advice on foundations, on how to use the land itself as a shield against the wind. When the time came to rebuild Providence Creek, they did not build the same way. The new town was built with humility. Root cellars were deepened into storm shelters, their designs based on Alara's dugout. New homes were built lower to the ground, with deep stone foundations, often dug into the protective lee of a hillside. The principle of her home, working with the land, not just upon it, became the guiding wisdom for the entire community. Marcus recovered, but he was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbled respect. He never asked for forgiveness in words, but he offered it in deeds. He returned the deed to the main farm, admitting his claim had been fraudulent, and spent the rest of his life helping his neighbors rebuild, his actions a long, silent apology. Elara's story spread far beyond the valley. Travelers and traders carried the tale of the cyclone of '83 and the woman who had survived it by digging into a worthless hole. Her shelter became a landmark, a testament to resilience. She never left the quarry. She expanded it, perfected it, her gardens growing, her livestock thriving. She lived a life of quiet peace, surrounded by the world she had built with her own 2 hands. She had been stripped of everything, her husband, her home, her name, and was left with nothing but a hole in the ground and the judgment of her peers. But in that discarded place, she found not an end, but a beginning. She proved that the greatest strength is not in what is built to touch the sky, but in the foundations dug deep into the earth. Her legacy was written not in a history book, but in the very landscape of the rebuilt town, a quiet and enduring lesson that true safety comes from wisdom, not wealth, and that the grace to forgive is the strongest shelter of all.